want me to kind of lean in and talk to that one, is it?
Good evening, everyone.
I'll just go over here to that.
You're all very welcome.
Oh, yeah.
Good day on Thrönona Shaw. For everybody else that are here, herzlichen Willkommen for all our German friends. This evening we begin the Heinrich Böll Weekend with a very, very special evening that has been brought together by Poetry Ireland in its association with Mayo Arts Office and the Heinrich Böll Weekend. The title of this evening is Years Ago, I Went to Achill for Easter. Eavan Boland, A Kind of Scar. So this evening is a tribute to Eavan Boland. In 1989, Eavan Boland published her famous essay, A Kind of Scar, setting out her vision for poetry in an Ireland that had previously been hostile to women writers, using Achill Island and an old woman that she met there as a starting point of her argument about the difficulties for a woman poet within a constraining national tradition. Over 3 decades later, and as part of the programme of events for Poetry Day Ireland 2023, which is also the 3rd anniversary of Eavan's death, a panel of writers and commentators come together here on Achill Island to perform their own work and to discuss Eavan's legacy and the landscape for women poets in Ireland in the 21st century. The event will be chaired by Nessa O'Mahony, writer in residence at the Heinrich Böll Cottage and editor of the Poetry Ireland Review 138, which is a special tribute issue to Eavan Boland. Nessa O'Mahony was born in Dublin. She is a Dublin-based poet. She won the National Women's Poetry Competition and was shortlisted for the Patrick Kavanagh Prize and Hennessy Literature Awards. She has published 5 books of poetry, and her most recent is The Hollow Woman on the Island, which was published by Salmon Poetry in May 2019. Like I said, Nessa has edited the Eavan Boland special issue, which will be available at the end of the hall when we finish here this evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to Nessa O'Mahony.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and thank you so much to the Heinrich Böll Memorial Weekend for extending the invitation for us to come along tonight, and indeed to Poetry Ireland for their sterling work in putting this event together. As you just heard, this event really came out of an essay that Eavan Boland, who died 3 years ago today, wrote and published in the late 1980s called A Kind of Scar. It was a series of, one of a series of pamphlets by women writers described as provocative, polemical pamphlets on contemporary issues and controversies by Irish women writers, thinkers and activists. And in this essay, Eavan uses a visit that she made here at Easter in the early 1960s when she was a very young student in Trinity College. And she encountered an elderly woman who was the caretaker of this cottage in Achill, who told her stories about Achill in the famine and women's lives. And Eavan realised how little she knew, how little she had been taught about both that period in history, but also the lives of the women, ordinary women's lives. And the one place that she definitely didn't find those experiences was in Irish poetry. Irish poetry, if it mentioned women, it was usually woman as subject or woman as symbol, the Sean Van Vocht, the Roisin Dubh, the Colleen Bawn. But nowhere could Eavan see poetry that was consistently being written and published by women. So it was quite a provocative essay, and certainly in the years that have followed, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that there were indeed a number of women poets publishing in Ireland in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and being published in the little magazines and in book form. But Eavan wouldn't have been aware of that because the canon was so resolutely male. She was in Trinity in the 1960s. I studied English literature in the 1980s in UCD, and the only woman who was being studied was Emily Dickinson, and I'm pretty sure she was about 150 years dead by the time we got to study her. So things hadn't changed that much. So it felt like a wonderful opportunity to come back to Achill. I know from Eavan's daughters, Eavan, Frances and Sarah, that she regularly holidayed on Achill with her family. She loved this place very much. It seemed like a wonderful opportunity to come back here with some of the finest women writers currently writing in Ireland, and also one of the finest musicians that lives in the general area, Laoise, to largely perform, to read their poems, to read both, poets who have influenced them, but also to read their wonderful work. And then the last quarter of the evening is just going to be a general discussion about that notion of legacy, about that notion of foremothers and influences. So Laoise Kelly is here and is kindly going to start the event. We have three wonderful women poets, Moya Cannon, Geraldine Mitchell and Mary O'Mahony. They're going to read alphabetically, so we'll hear from Moya first, then Geraldine, and then finally Mary. And we're going to be serenaded at various points by Laoise. So I'm going to ask Laoise to kick us off, and then I'll introduce the first reader then.
Gurmag Nessa, I'm honoured to be here this evening amongst our greatest poets. It really is truly an honour, and I've really enjoyed learning more about Eavan Boland in the last few weeks, how inspirational she was, and love her poetry, and these are the right people to be talking about it, not me. So just before we begin that journey about Eavan, I'd like to acknowledge the deep shock and grief and sadness on the island today for the loss of Finbar Cafferty. And we want to just send this tune from us all out to the family, and we wish them just all our love.
guest reader tonight is Moya Cannon, who was born in Donegal but now lives in Dublin. She published in 1991, her first collection, Or, which had won the Brendan Behan Award. She's since published 5 collections of poetry and received the O'Shaughnessy Award from the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota in 2001, and in 2011 her collection Hands was shortlisted for the Irish Times Poetry Prize, with her collected poems being published by Carcanet Press in 2021. She writes incredibly about the west of Ireland. I have borrowed words that she's used, the companionable pins she mentions when referring to the 12 pins. It's such a delight to have her here tonight. Moya.
Gurmaigad Nessa, agus Gurmaigad Laoise. It's ionach an pléisiúr bhíonn Seán Nocht. It's a real pleasure to be back in Achill, and great pleasure to be here at the Heinrich Böll Weekend. So I say good evening, good Abend, etc. agus Gurmaigad. I'm going to start actually by reading the poem to which Nessa alluded, The Achill Woman, from her sequence Outside History. And any of us who grew up in the countryside in Ireland will recognise this woman. She was, and this incredible irony that that Nessa mentioned, you know, where she was studying the very refined poets of the Silver Age, who were also they were sort of the conquistadores really in Ireland as well. People. But it's, and she just became very much sort of aware of that. The Achill Woman. She came up the hill carrying water. She wore a half-buttoned wool cardigan, a tea towel around her waist. She pushed the hair out of her eyes with her free hand and put the bucket down. The zinc music of the handle on the rim tuned the evening. An Easter moon rose. In the next door field, a stream was a fluid sunset, and then stars. I remember the cold rosiness of her hands. She bent down and blew on them like broth. And around her waist, on a white background, in coarse woven letters, the words glass cloth. And she was nearly finished for the day, and I was all talk, raw from college, weekending at a friend's cottage, with one suitcase and the set text of the court poets of the Silver Age. We stayed putting down time until the evening turned cold without warning. She said goodnight and started down the hill. The grass changed from lavender to black. The trees turned back to cold outlines. You could taste frost. But nothing now can change the way I went indoors, chilled by the wind, and made a fire and took down my book and opened it, and failed to comprehend the harmonies of servitude, the grace music gives to flattery and language borrows from ambition, and how I fell asleep, oblivious to the planets clouding over in the skies, the slow decline of the spring moon, the songs crying out their ironies. Nessa edited a really wonderful edition of Poetry Ireland Review, which I'd recommend to all of you to buy. It's in honour of Eavan Boland. Really a very special work. And many of us were asked to contribute a poem, and I'll read the poem which I contributed because I thought it might suit. There's been much talk of the Magdalen laundries, etc. in the last 10 years. One of these things which were under our noses all the time. We didn't see them. We wonder what's under our nose now that we don't see. And we look back and say, how could we have let that happen? But when I was growing up in Donegal, and I'm sure it's the same here, very often if a girl became, one of the older girls in the family became pregnant, the child was kept by the family, which was and raised as the youngest child in the family, and nothing was said about it. So I had an encounter one time going up from Galway to Donegal on Fido O'Donnell's bus, maybe about 25 years ago, and it stuck in my head. This man sat in beside me, and he was one of those children, but he didn't know till he grew up. So this is called The First He'd Heard of It. And there's an epigraph from John B. Keane. He referred one time to the great Irish sin of respectability. So the first he'd heard of it. Sometimes it was the doctor's wife who drove the girl at dawn to the house of refuge and shame. My uncle drove a hackney car, told of driving a girl, her baby and parents on the way to give the child a better chance in life. The girl crying in the back seat and not wanting at all to part with her. There were the 3 girls in my year who didn't return to school the September after doing their intermediate cert and giving birth. And there was a man from Inishowen who sat beside me on the bus from Galway to Letterkenny, who nipped off more than once for a drink, and who told me of an older sister who worked in the shirt factory in Derry, and how fond they were of each other, and how, when she was ill and dying, he had run barefoot in the dark to hammer on the doctor's door, and of how much later in Scotland he was in love with a girl, and they were engaged, and the priest read the riot act to him and asked who did he think he was to try to marry a respectable girl. And that was the first he'd heard of it. I was fortunate, as so many others have been, to spend a couple of weeks at the Heinrich Böll cottage here, and I think it was 2019. And so I'm going to read a couple of really wonderful opportunities. So I'd just like to thank John McHugh and all of those involved in looking after the Heinrich Böll cottage, and of course the Heinrich Böll committee. So vielen Dank. I'm going to read two little Achill poems that came out of that time. This one's very short, and it relates to the theme of this week's Heinrich Böll Weekend as it happens. As you approach Achill, you see the mountains. What you don't see are something just as beautiful. It's Corrie Lakes, so this is Island Corrie. Curving back by the northern cliffs, where a pale scar shows that another slice of mountain has succumbed to this century's hard seas and grey storms, we halt at a rim, and far below us in June sunlight blows the big elongated O of Loch Bonafreva, ringed in this summer's long drought with a necklace of bleached schist. Cupped pan of Cruachan, gift of a glacier, silver doubloon of Achill. While I was here, I did a bit of rambling around, obviously, who couldn't, in such a beautiful place. It'd be crazy not to. And one day I went down to the south of the island and into the graveyard at St. Davenant's Church and came across what I thought might be a landlord's grave or something, and discovered that it was in fact the grave belonging to those who were drowned in the 1894 disaster at Westport, when young people were heading off to Scotland and their cooker capsized outside Westport, and a very large number, I'm trying to remember now, is it 32 young people were drowned. And most of them, when I was looking at the names, it was harrowing. Most of them were girls, and they were the same names as the girls I went to school with. There were Marys and Bridgets and Kates, and then there were also, of course, Martins and Joes. Anyway, it was so moving. So I wrote what came out as a song. I'm not going to sing it, but anyway, I'll just read it. So it's called 8 Marys, 4 Bridgets, 3 Kates. 400 left Achill that morning, 32 would come home on the train, torn shawls on the keystones of Westport. Some never saw Achill again. In Scotland, to earn the back rent, tatty hokers the name they would know. Here they were Mary and Bridget, Pat, Sibby, and Honor and Joe. At Cloughmore on June the 14th, 4 hookers lay out from the quay. The curraghs were rowed out to meet them, and the Victory headed away. The steamer they sighted near Westport. Girls crowded all onto one side, singing and laughing and waving. The wind changed, and the boat it capsized. Young Tom Burke and Edward O'Malley saw it happen and rowed to their aid. On the quayside in Westport they laid them. 8 Marys, 4 Bridgets, 3 Kates. 2 days later, the iron track was opened. On the first train, those coffins came home. The boreens were black nearing Achill, with people who walked there to mourn. An old man was drowned and a small girl, Mary Dugan, the blind fiddler's wife. From the valley, the 3 Malley sisters, each one in the flower of young life. In Blenaskell, the Coonies keened Nancy and Joseph and young Martin too. Such a blight had never struck Achill, such a sorrow Coran never knew. They sleep by the sea in Kildavenant, where lilies grow tall near the brine, and maybe the gentle St. Davenant helped those mothers and fathers survive. It was poverty forced them to leave home, and greed causes poverty still. Poor people still put out in small boats, and young bodies wash in on the tide. Now, in the year 2000, I heard a wonderful lecture in Galway about the economic strategies of women in the Atlantic coastline. How women had all sorts of the egg money, little strategies for making money, which would do something very important for their family. Get an apprenticeship or an education, something like this. And it was like the egg money or the pig money or the lace money, or in many cases actually working as a wet nurse in some cultures. And I was thinking, if in Ireland the equivalent would probably be the Aran knitting, again lace, and in more recent times, the women in the Gaeltacht who kept scolari, and also the B&Bs, etc. So, but needlework was one of the things. So I just thought I'd write a little poem about this, about women's work, needlework, and how apparently it didn't occur to me until relatively recently. I read in an article on archaeology that it was our ability to sew which allowed people to move up out of Africa, to move further north. We could make tents and live in colder climates. Needlework's far more important than people give it credit for. And then it's given credit. Needlework. The festival of broken needles at the start of Japan's New Year, when kimono makers gathered to pray for improved skills, to give thanks to their diminutive broken tools, to tenderly deposit old needles broken in silk. Needlework. How long, how far back do the tough threads run? Bone, horn, mammoth ivory needles, or awls that pierced and laced with sinew, furs and hides that allowed our forefathers to walk northwards to stitch tents in snowy edgelands. Wooden iron needles that wrought nets to trap lusting, homing salmon. Needlework which granted poor women a small sway over destiny. The knitter, lace maker, embroiderer, or seamstress, who, under a candle or an oil lamp, over an open fire, clothed children dreaming in the next room, stitched them an apprenticeship, a dowry, an education, a sea passage to a new land. The 2 proud old sisters in East Tyrone, half blind from the white linen embroidery that had made their brother a priest. The woman from Ranafast, who rested 2 needles and the in-curled sleeve of an Aran cardigan on the table, pointed to the ceiling and said, "I knit the roof," which she had done actually. Her knitting had paid for the new roof. I'll read one more poem of my own, and then one by somebody who's terribly important to me. She's Denise Levertov, very wonderful, wonderful American poet. And, okay, my grandfather, this was a poem that I tried to write for years. Well, the idea was there, as it often is, festering for years, but I managed to finish it in 2016. In 1966, when I was 10, I was very keen to die for Ireland, and it's good to get it out of your system young. But anyway, my grandfather had headed off from Tyrone, his farm in Tyrone, with his horse and trap, or his pony and trap, it was a horse, to die for Ireland. And with just a little bit of folklore about what he said to his wife. And but he got the countermanding order, and he came back. And we were very sad that he wasn't a hero, you know. But I often wondered what my grandmother thought. So, but you don't know. I studied history, and I realised that we only know what's in the documents. And poor people's history, women's history, is very poorly documented. So we don't know what they thought. But I wondered if my grandmother was as sad as my grandfather. So this is called the Countermanding Order, 1916. And my young grandmother, what of her? Was she too dejected? No documentary evidence exists. My mother, too young at 7 months to remember herself, used to tell us. She heard the horse and trap in the yard again and could not believe her ears. What was my grandmother doing? Did she clear away a half-eaten Easter dinner, talking distractedly to her 2 little boys as she scraped jelly from a glass bowl? Did she mix feed for hens or pigs, or wonder about bringing cattle in for milking? Did she pray, or take out her handwork? Was she putting the baby down for her rest? Only hours earlier, in the swept farmyard, she had said goodbye to her husband of 6 years, her exiled lover of 7 more, whose letters had been carried in steamships across Caribbean and Atlantic tides. On this Sunday morning, had they embraced as he headed for the muster at Dungannon, as he enjoined her to bring up the children as good Catholics and good Irish men and Irish women. My mother, in old age, was to remark with a raised eyebrow, wasn't it a bit cool of them all the same? Now, as the trap clattered in through the gate, and the horse, Rebel, halted in his familiar place, did my young grandmother wipe her hands on her apron? Did she rush to the door? Although the rising had been called off, although the great cause seemed lost again, did her heart not rejoice? And I'll finish with a poem by a wonderful poet and political activist and environmental activist, Denise Levertov, for Joanna Macy, who again was a great peacemaker and activist. And it's called A Blessing. Perhaps I should get up here actually to the pulpit and declaim it. So, and thank you very much for listening. Real pleasure to be here with Mary and Geraldine. Your river is in full flood, she said. Work on, use these weeks well. She was leaving with springy step, a woman herself renewed, her life risen up from the root of despair she'd bent low to touch, risen empowered. Her work now could embrace more. She imagined anew the man's totem tree and its taproot, the woman's chosen lichen, patiently composting rock, another's needful swamp, the tribal migrations, swaying schemes rotating their leaders, pace unflagging, and the need of each threatened thing to be. She had met with the council of all beings. You give me my life, she said to the just written poems, long-legged foals surprised to be standing. The poet waving farewell is not so sure of the river. Is it indeed strong flowing, generous? Was there largesse for alluvial, black, seed-hungry fields? Or had a flash flood swept down these tokens to be plucked ashore, rescued only to watch the waters recede from stones of an arid valley. But the traveller's words are leaven. They work in the poet. The river swiftly goes on, braiding its heavy tresses, brown and flashing, as far as the eye can see. Grandmichael.
Wonderful, wonderful start. Our next reader is Geraldine Mitchell, who was born in Dublin and since 2000 has been living further down the Mayo coast. I get confused what's up, what's down. Close to Louisburg. She has published 4 collections of poetry with Ireland House, the most recent being Mute, Unmute in 2020. And she's also the author of 2 novels for children. And in 1997, her biography of Muriel Gahan, Deeds Not Words, was published by Townhouse. And in 2008, she won the Patrick Kavanagh Award. Geraldine is wonderfully lucky in being able to divide her time between close to the Pyrenees in France and glorious Louisburg. And it is wonderful to have her here tonight. Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Nessa. And thank you, I repeat my thanks to everyone who's been involved in organising this wonderful event. Sad event, but wonderful nonetheless. The last time I stood up here to read a poem was in August 2019, and there was an event to commemorate the life of MacDara Woods, and I was a part of that. And I did a course, a workshop with MacDara, and I think it was 2005. Every year he'd come for the Scollachla and do a week of creative writing, and it was sort of pivotal for me because I was a late starter with poetry, and it was there I met Anne Shannon. So I just like to remember MacDara and Anne here tonight with great fondness. I'm going to start with a poem of Eavan's. It's called The Lost Art of Letter Writing. And although it would seem to be about the past and emigrants who when they went to America, there was the American wake and they were gone, but nothing really has changed. I looked up the figures the other day. 32 million refugees in the world, 100 million internally displaced people. So separation and loss from home are still very much a thing in spite of emails and WhatsApp and all the rest. The lost art of letter writing. The ratio of daylight to handwriting was the same as lace making to eyesight. The paper was so thin it skinned air. The hand was fire and the page tinder. Everything burned away except the one place they singled out between fingers held over a letter pad they set aside for the long evenings of their leave-takings, always asking after what they kept losing, always performing even when a shadow fell across the page and they knew the answer was not forthcoming, the same action. First, the leaning down, the pen becoming a staff to walk fields with as they vanished underfoot into memory. Then the letting up, the lighter stroke, which brought back crane's bill and thistle, a bicycle wheel rusting, an iron circle hurting the grass again, and the hedges veiled in hawthorn again, just in time for the May novenas, recited in sweet air on a road leading to another road, then another one, widening to a motorway with 4 lanes, ending in a new town on the edge of a city they will never see. And if we say an art is lost when it no longer knows how to teach a sorrow to speak, come, see the way we lost it, stacking letters in the attic, going downstairs so as not to listen to the fields stirring at night as they became memory, and in the morning as they became ink. What we did so as not to hear them whispering the only question they knew by heart, the only one they learned from all those epistles of air and unreachable distance, how to ask, is it still there? The first poem I'm going to read of mine is, I wrote it actually on the day of Eavan's funeral. She died, as Nessa said, this day 3 years ago, and her funeral was on the 1st of May. So this is called Of Fire and Water, in memory of Eavan Boland. I wait and watch as the cracked red plastic watering can fills up, the yellow hose administering its morning panacea, a transfusion the whole garden has been holding out for. A jostle sloshes to the top, threatens to spill over. How are we supposed to hold it in now that we have lost the shame of welling up in public places, of naming love and naming it again, clapping it out in nightly rhythms among strangers, or silently, alone, weeping under bursting trees as birds scribble song after song on the sky's rinsed roof? When I lit the candle on the windowsill, that bleak morning awash with light, it was as if the sun would not let its rival shine. But there it stayed all day, a delicate, fiery finger, a spire of flame, resolute, intense, a lone voice reaching up, ungraspable, unquenchable, until at last the flare began to gutter, pulled back into the dark weave of the wick, leaving only an acrid plume to interrogate the empty space above. I think somebody suggested, we were on in lockdown obviously at the time in 1st of May 2020, and somebody had said because there couldn't be a public funeral that we perhaps light a candle, which is how that came about. I too have been lucky to have a stay, I think 2 stays in the Heinrich Böll cottage. And I thought I'd read this from my, I can't remember now, it's the second collection thing, about something, one of the times I was there, it was over Halloween, and things happened in the night. Things happened in the day as well in that house. I haven't checked with other people, but there's a kind of I would come out of a room and go into the wrong room. It was like there was some sort of magnetic force in the middle. But this is called Small Mercy. Enfolded in an empty house, for living company a spider and a wilting basil plant, rimmed round by stone, rolled back to the thick centre of silence, where the sun sings to a crumb of bread and the spider's missing leg becomes the focus of the morning's distillation. Last night they jostled at the foot of the bed, the unnamed dead, asked for nothing save to be kept in our minds, where the air is, where we are. Left meekly as obedient dogs, the last chill of camphor breathed back into the river-rounded stones of this penitential tholos. Updraft of air, fresh earth, the sweet breath of children. So one of Eavan's recurring themes, in fact perhaps all her life, was how to rescue the unrecorded past from the over-recorded history. And when I reread her book of essays, Object Lessons, in which there's a version of the essay that Nessa was talking about, that this event is called after, I was very struck by the story of her grandmother's death. Her mother's mother died giving birth to her 5th daughter. Eavan's mother was the 4th, and then her mother had to go to Dublin to have the baby all on her own in Holles Street Hospital in Dublin, and died giving birth. And many things resonated with me because it was the year 1909, and both my parents were born in 1909. My father in Dublin, so the same year of women giving birth. And I had, in my new collection, I have a section in the middle which tries to recover bring back into memory. Sorry, I didn't say that Eavan's, her grandmother's death wasn't talked about. She knew very little. It wasn't something that her mother was able to talk about, or in fact herself knew very much about. And in my family, my great aunt Geraldine, after whom I'm called, similarly, she was born, and her mother, who was also Geraldine, died giving birth to her. And so my great aunt Geraldine, after whom I am called, had a very, very unhappy life, and took her own life at the age of 48, but was never mentioned in my family. The only reason I know about her is because I had one aunt who wanted me to know why I was called Geraldine. So it's that same thing about things that are not told, probably more out of pain than shame, but in so much of Eavan's work is bringing people back into where the air is, where we are, like I say in the poem. So in the middle section of my book, Mute Unmute, is trying to bring my great aunt Geraldine back to, not to life, obviously, but to memory. And it's a sequence of 19 short poems. I will read a few. I won't read many. But, and it's an evocation. I know so little about her life, but I've tried to bring her spirit back in some way. Eavan referred to her grandmother's death as another of history's erasures. I thought erasure is just such a good word. Because wind, because rain, because skin over bone, because night worn thin, because web, because fabric, because blanket, because patchwork quilt, because stitch, 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 because love, because story, because linked arms, stout legs, because holding, because held, because graveyards so full, because with us forever, because we will not forget, because human bridge, because love, because story. As if time was distance, I see you drift out to sea on an absence of years. As if distance was time, I measure the years that separate your life from mine. As if time and distance did not exist, I imagine us sitting in silence, side by side. Who was that woman dressed all in white, looking down on the street in the chill hours of a winter's night through moonlit shutter slats? Like a girl in a film, dreaming the part of a newly wedded woman, shadow pooling her delicate neck, eyes welled, remembering the mother she never knew. Stories of calving, the pain of her birth, a small body slithering into rank straw at the lowing cow's feet. A heifer, too young to know how to lick, to flip the raw pain, nudge it to its feet in the unlit bedroom of the seaside village where she began to bleed, far from a doctor's help, leaving the infant orphaned for life. A door, without keyhole or handle, hinged for the entrance of her heart. A twist of rope, rough wisps visible against the fading light. No one walks this way for fear of hidden roots, or sleeping curs roused to frenzied barks. A spider spins its web between the web pull and the weathered door. It sits and waits, it watches, it has time. Silence becomes silk on the last wheeze of night. The S of sorry snakes through the eye of hollow self, slips in forked tongue stitches, X by X, through the sampler's muslin sheet, needle, cotton, blood. She goes back to the seaside house on a windless winter's day. Bats dangle from the kitchen beams, patient, leathered souls. She strokes the silence, pulls it round her, shoulders it through fractured door frames as she ghosts from room to room. Echoes dance in unremembered corners, jig her from the shiver of her aging skin. The still air fills her ears. By dawn, she's fallen back onto a feather bed of incremental sound. Dogs have set each other off, cockerels too. that merely stretch their necks to announce the imminence of a morning where the spider's web, so patiently constructed, now hangs in tatters. I'm just going to get a mouthful of water before I have just 2 more. Thank you. Have I time, Nessa, for 2? Yeah. So, to get a little bit more cheerful, out in the air, I have 2 poems about birds. I'm a little bit obsessed with birds. The first one is, it's in the collection. It's my daughter was flying on a long-haul flight from the southern hemisphere. I was in her house I have 2 children who both live in France. That's why I go to the Pyrenees. It's not just, a little fantasy. I actually have my 2 children and their families out there. So this is one's anxiety when a loved one is up in the air. As my daughter flies north, I examine my fear. All night I cup you in my feathered hands and picture in the studded sky a silver bird, cold carcass, you slumbering in the hum, the cool penumbra, hushed comfort of the steward's slender palms. This morning, as I lean into the wind, a kestrel rides a fold of pillowed air, buoyed up by nothing but its own intent, its feathers spread to steer and hold, trust the instinct it was born with. 6 hoopers suddenly above me, a honking contrail quaffing sun, wings in steady semaphore to the unfledged world. They land on liquid runways, knead the water, glide to silken stops. Trust us, they seem to say. Your stiff-winged bird will make soft landing. We taught you all you know of flight. And Nessa very kindly edited this amazing, as Moya said, it really is a fantastic issue of Poetry Ireland Review, as are most. The other poem was also in Poetry Ireland Review. But this poem, if I can find it, yes, is where my children are in the south of France. It's on the migration path of cranes. So you see them congregate to move south, and if you're lucky, you also, if you're there at the right time, they pass over, heading north in the spring. I also was thinking this could be, you could see this as a young child taking back language, but it really just came from this amazing sight of scores and scores of cranes circling the sky. Skywriting summer's end. This angry child is tired of learning letters, has grabbed the lot, flung them high, hurled them wide to make up words in a language only she can read. The scattered alphabet drifts a blue-domed sky, fistfuls of black confetti, a languorous glide and soar above the cushioned warmth that holds it up. The small girl feels a gentle shower of jumbled meanings on her upturned face, fluttered from the swirl, from the wheeling dance of indecision. Will we? Won't we? Who's in charge? Shall we go now? Is it time? Balletic questions, written plain as ABC by a turbulence of circling cranes on the immense September sky. So, Nessa asked us to think of a poem, somebody who influenced us, or a favourite poem, and 2 poets who are more or less contemporaries, of Eavan, are Eleni Chilinon and Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, and both in different ways were incredibly supportive of me when I was starting out. And I thought, how can I bring them in? So I found a rather cheeky poem of Nuala's, translated into English by Elaine. So I have them both in Pharaoh's Daughter. So just to lighten, sorry, my mind come over as rather heavy, I think, but just to To lighten the tone, perhaps it's called Looking at a Man. Take them off, one by one, trousers and worn grey singlet. Put your glasses on the shelf alongside comb and handkerchief. And walk across the floor on my right hand to the foot of the bed until I can run my eyes all down the dark valleys of your skin. Let them stroke the wonderful bones. And don't be impatient with me tonight. Don't prompt me, how will we do it? Relax. Understand how I can hardly, faced with the naked evidence, satisfy my eyes or close them, even to touch. Man, so long in your limbs, so broad-shouldered, fine-waisted, fair, masculine from hair to toenails, and your sex perfect in its place. You're the one they should praise in public places, the one should be handed trophies and checks. You're the model for the artist's hand, standing before me in your skin and a wristwatch.
So thank you.
I think I may have forgotten at the very beginning to mention that Laoise Kelly, originally from Westport and now living on Achill Island, is regarded as one of the most significant harpers of her generation. You know this because she lives with you. But I just wanted to say that she is a founding member of a group, an ensemble called Fiddle Tree, who are an international collective who play instruments all made from the same tree. I think that's the most amazing concept I've ever heard of. And her latest album is Lurag na Léachra with Monaghan Uilleann Piper Tirnán Udinchon. So we're going to hear a little more from Laoise now.
So the tune I'm going to play is in memory of Anne that Geraldine mentioned, because the Heinrich Böll committee are grieving our lovely Anne Shannon, and I played this at her funeral, and it's a tune that came out of another lovely lady that I lost, and similarly gorgeous people, animal lovers, and I always feel a connection to Anne being a cat adoptee. You know, one of those people who the cat adopts you, as opposed to the way around. Anyway, so this is called Colleen Luss on Crumkin, which is the Daffodil Girl, and I'm going to tune up a little bit first.
And our final reader, and I don't know how we've got there so quickly, our final reader is Mary O'Malley, another local girl, and that she is from down the road in Connemara, and has lived in Moycullen for the last number of years. She was an important member of the Council of Poetry Ireland. She's held residencies in Paris, in New York, Derry, NUI Galway, very active in environmental education, a member of Aesthona, and has won many awards for her poetry, including the University of Limerick Writers' Fellowship in 2016. She has two wonderful pieces in the Poetry Ireland review. I'm not sure whether she planned to read her poem April. I was hoping that she might. And she also has a wonderful essay about that very special relationship she had with Eavan Boland, who was, I think, a little her senior, but who was able to sort of give her a lot of advice about rhyme and never to be categorised as a West of Ireland writer, and lots of important advice. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Mary.
Dí agus tá arm de Achill Island. I was also a resident in the Boyle House, and I can't remember what I wrote there, but I wrote a good deal of a book, and the thing that fascinated me about it was the underfloor heating. My house at the time did not have underfloor heating, and it still doesn't. And I was just amazed by that. But also to be back in this church. I think the last time I read here was for Sunday Miscellany, if I'm not mistaken, several years back. I'm going to open, I think it's fitting, with a poem of Eavan's own, and it's difficult for me. It's very moving to be here, and I want to thank Nessa and Poetry Ireland, because I pretended to myself, basically, that Eavan was still in America. That's how I dealt with her being gone. I knew she was, but because we didn't have a funeral, and not having a funeral, as we know from lockdown, is a very strange thing for somebody you're close to. I think it can take a lot longer to realise how things are. So it's important, it's very important to commemorate her. So I will just read Unheroic, because this is where Eavan and I certainly differed in many ways. We were not alike women, and all the more reason for me to be grateful. She took me up, I was a younger poet, and she took me up very early on when she met me. For some reason, I was just riveted by her Achill woman, in fact, initially, because it was the first time I had encountered a real woman of the sort that I grew up with and knew in poetry in English. Not in Irish, but in English. And it was curious. I was making the other journey, if you like, from that background to Trinity, or if not Trinity, although I did in fact end up doing residency there. So Unheroic. It was an Irish summer. It was wet. It was a job. I was 17. I set the clock and caught the bus at 8 and leaned my head against the misty window. The city passed by. I got off above the Liffey on a street of statues, iron orators and granite patriots. Arms wide, lips apart, last words. I worked in a hotel. I carried trays. I carried keys. I saw the rooms when they were used and airless again, when they were aired and ready, and I stood above the road and stared down at silent eloquence and wet umbrellas. There was a man who lived in the hotel. I rarely saw him. There was a rumour that he had a wound from war or illness. No one seemed sure, which would not heal. And when he finished his day of ledgers and telephones, he went up the back stairs to his room to dress it. I never found out where it was. Someone said in his thigh. Someone said, deep in his side. He was a quiet man. He was a quiet man. He spoke softly. I saw him once or twice on the stairs at the back of the building by the laundry. Once I waited, curious to see him. Mostly I went home. I got my coat and walked bareheaded to the river, past the wet, bronze and unbroken skin of those who learned their time and knew their country. How do I know my country? Let me tell you, it has been hard to do. And when I do go back to difficult knowledge, it is not to the street, or those men raised high above the certainties they stood on, Ireland hero history, but how I went behind the linen room and up the stone stairs and climbed to the top and stood for a moment there, concealed by shadows, in a hiding place, waiting to see, wanting to look again into the patient face of the unhealed. Eavan. And what I learned from Eavan, first of all, I don't have the same tone as her, of course, but I learned to value tone, as you would in an instrument, but in poetry, and tone in English, particularly. Tony Harrison used to say that all the poets talked like God, and God, well, we know who God talked like. He talked like the public school boys. I'm going to read the first. I have two poems in memory of Eavan, and I thought I'd open and close my own reading with those poems. The first one I wrote actually very shortly after she died. Wolf Song. Sit still now, take up your pen. In this space before noise begins, tigers are visiting cities, and a white leopard sits on a lawn in suburbia. A wolf is walking along an empty beach in California. A poet sings his traces. Now she too is becoming history. Already the first slow movement of the strings is parting the silence. This is the point in the story when shadows, thin as blades, quiver in the April air. You can see the wolf through them. Soon he too will be gone, forgotten. This long free walk by the sea, a detour. The sea will remember him. When he licked my hand at the hawthorn, his traces sharpened the salt air. Because when Eavan died at that point, all those animals had begun to walk into the cities during lockdown. And it's the way at certain times when you see things through other things, as it were, when people are leaving. But there was another poet, and I think Eavan would want me to speak of her as well, who was the woman who actually gave me permission to write. After I'd known Eavan a while, she said, "You don't seem to feel the need to be given permission to write as a woman." And I hadn't thought about it. But partly the reasons where I grew up, women didn't seem to need permission to do things, but also because there was a poet on my curriculum called Marawakathi. Nobody said woman poet. Nobody said Dublin or Kerry or anything else. She was Fila agus Ordscolar, which indeed she was. And I was lucky enough later that Moya was very nice to me when we did meet, and we met a great number of times, including in her house in Howth, and had a great number of conversations. I was extremely embarrassed because I wasn't able to write in Irish, or I didn't feel I was anyway. And she was very generous to me. Bás Fila. And I should say that the poem ends with two of Mora's lines changed from Suntri Gronya, I think the last two lines there. There are times when we're stuck, nails hammered into the world awkwardly, and sit there rusting, and times we are loosened and pulled free, then lifted up and set down easy, wilder. Today, with your bright face before me, the breath of language lightens the air in which words stretch and old laws are kept. It is still about permission. The horses running off Sybil Head know nothing of that. They break over the land, making rhyme with their hoof beats. Cuddle, cuddle, a wanrin glay, cuddle gasav, Ilan Wachlin, J. Moya, cuddle, cuddle, arena grass, cuddle gasav, and Ilan Wachlin, I think is the... During lockdown, I nearly went nuts. I mean, it was horrific. Well, I thought it was. Other people were saying, oh, it's great. But we live on our own anyway. Most poets especially, I think. You know, I envied painters because they have that physical outlet, and musicians. And I had this weird eye thing where something happened to my eye, and it's referred to. You don't need to know the details of my medical history. So it's just that the poem arose out of this. It was a very distressing thing where a veil comes over your eye and there are flashes and so on. Escape. Maybe as a result of the sickness swamping the world for a year, I got James Joyce's eyes. It happened in a flash. 1 minute I was staring at a pheasant in Moycullen, the next at a rent receipt in Geneva and a box of unpaid bills, scores of hats for Nora. I had to bend close to the page for Searche. My sight got worse and my eyes burned through by Paris. Things were looking up. I wrote home daily for details and information on Connemara. Who owned such and such a field, and exactly how many cows were in the small haggard, who had gone away on the bog bawn, and who died, and how many were left, if any. I wrote to Stanny and dear Miss Weaver for money, and then to my aunt about the boats, who built them and their sail plans and dimensions. I did it all by letter from Paris, Geneva, Trieste. For the Wandering Rocks, 17 letters for their exact coordinates on June the 16th, 1904. There I stayed, out of reach of Facebook, though I Googled, tempted by the fabulous digressions, until the wake was stretching to infinity and back. Now I have my own eyes again, but in one, the left, a small island sometimes rises. One of the things that got me through lockdown was reading James Joyce's letters. And he plagued people for information constantly, and money. And information about Dublin. They're the most wonderful collection of letters. It's wonderful to read with Moya and Geraldine again, and to work with Laoise again. And I'll read a music poem because I'll read it for you, Laoise, although it's for a different kind of musician, but I think it applies. It's called A Jig in Space-Time, and it's about the last session I was ever at with Alec Finn. And I just got a phone call and said, will you come out? And there weren't many people there, and it was about the conversation that goes on, the sort of hint and allegation conversation during a gig when it's just the musicians and it's not a concert. At 4:30 on Wednesday afternoon, instead of working, I went by invitation to a quiet pub in Oranmore, where I learned that Mount Cisco is in Corofin, to avoid soundmen in leather trousers, that the greyhound at the bar drinks gin, while the horse beside her is a Guinness man, and objects to talking dogs and barons, that a wild duck can lead a hawk astray. Then the fiddles, the bouzouki and the box kicked in. They led us to the Shanawak tube station, one of the 7 stops on the cosmic line, a wormhole in space-time, built by Navi musicians, where they tunnelled and played to bring here, there, and there, here, where the pieces of a broken cup could fly back up and reassemble in the hand, time after sweetened time, Mr. Feynman, until the tune stopped and the train reversed. Because so many of the tunes and so much of our record, which from my background was mostly kept not in documents, but in music and song and in story. And so much of that was preserved when I was growing up in England, because the musicians, so many of them had gone, and America and so on. And it has left me with a lifelong interest in how place travels, which is probably why I got lost in Achill this evening. It just travels round when you're not looking. I read two more poems, the last one also being the one that Nessa alluded to in her. I have to again just say Nessa is such a fantastic worker, and it's much appreciated. She does an enormous amount of work on our behalf and has done for today. And Gurmina Mahav, Nessa. This is a poem, it's a public poem, which is an odd sort of a thing. But because of the tradition, I have always believed that the poet can be occasionally allowed public utterance. I don't see any contradiction, really. This was a hard one. I was commissioned by Poetry Ireland to write a poem for the end, as it were, of lockdown, which I ended up reading on the coldest day ever outside and nearly getting pneumonia out of it. It's called The Lucky Ones. Dystopia is sudden. The whisper from Wuhan swelled to a rumour. By St. Patrick's Day we were stone cold sober. Most kept terror a hair's breadth away with uneasy humour. But from long habit I was uncertain and afraid. Soon we were zooming on empty pews, silent as if we too were absent. Still the swallows arrived from their warm galaxy. They cut windows in the sky and raised our flat world up like a blue circus tent. There are limits to living by proxy. Though the poppies lasted all that summer and the weight of that beauty on its frail stems was too much to bear, the dead rustled like leaves in the air. But beauty and the new life pushing up out of the mulch history leaves under our feet is what gets us through. That and what most call love, and some call tomorrow. Majin mach the gausamach. The voices we've lost echo. Nobody thrives on separation, but we're lucky, we say, even so. A few small boys explode onto a pitch, spinning, their faces all like new suns, learning their orbits on the hop of a ball. Then time snaps back. The air is charged with fumes and rust, and suddenly it's over. The future, not the past, is in the ascendant. Hope is out of the box again, a hair rising to its full height, ears tuned to some satellite, older than the moon. She sniffs the air. A twitch and we're off, complaining, a bit stiff, but tumbling into the wonderful mess of an ordinary night, sitting at one another's tables. The shades of our dead hungrily joining the conversation, the days opening ahead. Thank you. And I'll just finish with April, as Nessa wanted. Forgive me. April, which I think was in the Irish Times a while back. It's not so much where as how the day breaks, or when the flower on the blackthorn shines between the spines, pulsing under the moon, as that we leave it there alone, sensible to its cold night glow. Each tiny flower holds the light, austere. Then it's gone for another year, after one brief wind, and the bright flowers are scattered on the ground like words, seeds for the dead who come to feed a while in our dimension, disguised as birds. Good Maggie.
We have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. We might need to just move furniture a little, just to make people visible, because we're going to be staying seated down.
New aspects of it to light, I would have thought.
I've been really struck, and one of the things I admire so much about Eavan and this opportunity that Nessa has given us to go back to our work and really read in a more concentrated, or for me, in a more concentrated way, is her openness. And as the older she got, the more welcoming and inclusive she was. But what she said, and in Object Lessons, which came out in 1994, and I actually wrote it down because I want to keep it, she spoke about she said, I'll paraphrase, that basically it has to be good poetry. It can't be the political, the ethical, the feminist doesn't automatically make good poetry. The poetry comes first, and that she also said that her fight for women at the end of the day was not, it was for poetry, it was for language and poetry. Isn't that right? And at the end of her wonderful poem, Anna Liffey, she says that, something like, in the end, it won't matter that I was a woman, I'm sure of that. And she ends up saying, I had a voice, or I was a voice, or I had a voice. I was a voice. Everything that burdened and distinguished me will be lost in this. I was a voice. So I think that was really interesting. And a kind of warning note that it's, of course, diversity, acceptance of diversity is essential, and it's wonderful to see the openness, but we have to protect poetry as well in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was absolutely articulate about the difference between poetry and prose. And polemic is polemic, and poetry is poetry, and that's one of the eternal challenges, I think. But what I liked about her was she did not separate. I mean, if you read almost any of the Latin poets and a lot of the American poets, there were political, there was politically sensitive subject matter in a lot of cases. I mean, poetry that isn't good poetry doesn't survive, so I think that history takes care of that in a way. But she was very, very clear about the difference, at any rate in her conversations with me, and in everything she wrote, I think.
I don't want to keep people too late. I'm just wondering, are there any questions from the audience? Is there anything anybody'd like to ask these wonderful poets? Yes.
Thank you very much. You've all spoken very movingly about your relationships with older poets or other poets, women poets. What would you say now to a young woman poet, let's say, depends how you define young, but let's say under 30 for our purposes?
Thank you for asking that question.
I'd say don't talk about it, do it. And then I'd say read for pleasure, read very widely, read in translation, and because it's those until you meet the writer which makes your blood sing, and then follow that writer. Find out everything you can about them. One writer will lead you to another. And the other thing I would say is, I think it's rather important because as Mary says, it's a very lonely job. It can be. Although there's considerable evidence to the contrary, remember that poetry is not a competitive sport. You'll need community. I know I've been very grateful to the communities, the poetic communities I've come across, in Dublin and particularly in Galway. Wonderful people like Eva Burke and Rita Ann Higgins and Mary. Those things are really important. But just do it.
Those are the things that I read is the thing. But I would say the same to a young man as to a young woman. I'm working at the moment with some amazing TYs, and the first time I had more boys than girls in a group, and they're fantastic. So I would say the same, and not be distracted by the noisy. I mean, Moya saying it's not a competitive thing, absolutely not. But the social media makes it seem competitive, and that is just awful. I came across a lovely thing somebody said to reassure young poets that just about this noisy marketplace and everyone saying I'm better than you and I'm published here, so saying it's okay to stay in your Emily Dickinson pajamas, and that's my catch thing because that's okay, just stay in your Emily Dickinson pajamas, and your poems will be found in the end.
I just say, are you mad? No, I won't. I probably tend to say don't do it unless you have to be honest. Although because that was my situation, but no, I teach a lot and I love teaching, and I had a wonderful experience before I came here this evening, where a woman came up to me, a young woman, and she said, I was in your class 8 years ago, or 10 or 12, in one of the MAs in writing, and we eventually figured out who she was with, and her book, she's only now bringing a book out, and I think that's excellent, because it was somebody who was quite happy to wait. So
when you start very late, you can't wait too long. And I have to say that it was what?
She was probably about 21.
Oh yeah, when I was 59 when I won the Patrick Cannon, and it was thanks to Moya and Theo Dorgan who liked my poems.
Very precocious teenager.
And I have one piece of advice for the older poet, and I'm actually directing this at myself. Remember why you wanted to write in the first place, because it's easy to lose sight of that with all the other noise. I think that's about as much time as we have for the questions. We do want to hear more from Leisha before the end, if Leisha has another tune.
Yeah. I have one more tune.
She has hundreds.
This is The Fairy Queen, and it was ancient when it was taken down in 1792, and in fact it was classified as very ancient, and it's not like the Disney Fairy Queen. It was the rock and roll, tough cookie, fantastic, fearless leader like these amazing women. Very delighted to share the stage with you tonight. So, and I'm out of tune, so I'll just take that first, fix it first. But more of these gigs. Fair play to Poetry Ireland and Liz. Oh, here we go.
wealth of wonderful poetry, but also the discussion and the insight into the tradition of women's poetry that is strong and is being handed to the future. I'd like again an applause for all of those women. I want to say thank you to Poetry Ireland and the Mayo Arts Office and also the Heinrich Böll Association for this event this evening. You know, our Irish poets, Irish women poets, and I have to say also give a thumbs up to our Achill writers, both men and women, and they will be closing the weekend on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. But tomorrow evening we have the beginning of the usual Heinrich Böll Weekend. So the official opening for the weekend is tomorrow evening at 6:30. Registration in St. Thomas's Hall, just across the road here, and we look forward to all of you being there. And again, I want to say thank you for those 4